What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the JT Sports Podcast. I'm your host, JT. So, Florida State plays Alabama in week 1, right? And FSU's new quarterback, Thomas Castellanos, was talking spicy about the tie to On3 recently, saying that they don't have Nick Saban to save them against the wrath of the 2-10 Noles. He just doesn't see the Tide being able to stop him. And it's funny because Alabama is perceived to have fallen off with the retirement of Nick Saban, but yet they still are talked about as everybody's national championship game. People cannot stop talking about the Crimson Tide. Everybody's looking forward to having a shot at beating Alabama. But Thomas Castellanos crossed the fine line between confidence and downright stupidity. You don't poke the bear that is Kalen DeBoer. This is the same head coach that beat Brian Kelly, Kirby Smart, Dan Lanning twice, and Steve Sarkisian twice within the span of 3 years. Florida State is coming off the worst season in the history of their football program. Florida State should not be talking spicy about anybody that they play coming up this season with how bad last year went. And Thomas Castellanos, with these spicy comments, not only did he give Alabama billboard material, but he also just gave Florida State a death sentence in week 1. Alabama right now is a 14.5-point favorite going into this week 1 matchup against the Seminoles, and it's easily the biggest lock of week 1. Not only is Alabama going to cover that 14.5-point spread, but they're going to downright obliterate Florida State in week 1. Alabama has an elite defensive line and one of the best secondaries entering college football this season. And you got a Florida State offensive line that they've rebuilt through the portal that is going to take a little bit of time to gel and get chemistry. So they're going to get destroyed in this game. Florida State also has a bunch of new faces at wide receiver. You're going up against one of the best secondaries in the nation. You are not going to have an easy outing against Alabama in week 1, Thomas Castellanos. This is not the same Alabama team that you saw lose to Vanderbilt or get upset against Oklahoma. You are going up against an Alabama team that this season, they want to smash ants with a sledgehammer, as what Ryan Williams puts it. The last thing you want to do is give Alabama motivation. Not just did you give them motivation to beat you, but you gave them more motivation to downright squash you. This was already a squash match. This was David versus Goliath. But the only difference in how this story is going to end compared to the original one in the Bible is that David isn't going to have enough stones to take down the giant that is Alabama this season. This is one of the best teams in all of college football. They got an elite offense with arguably the best wide receiver trio in the nation. How is Florida State, with a new and young-looking secondary, going to be able to slow down Alabama's passing attack? We know that Ty Simpson is relatively unproven, but it definitely helps that he has a great group of wide receivers to sling the football to and one of the best offensive lines protecting them. Florida State has so many unknowns that it just makes it incredibly difficult to comprehend why Thomas Castellanos felt confident enough in making these statements. As I said, there's a difference between being confident and just being on the other line of stupidity, and Thomas Castellanos is on that other line. When Lenore Sellers, the quarterback of South Carolina, was asked about these statements, you know what he said? Alabama is still Alabama. He knows what it's like going up against this team. They're fast. They're freakishly athletic. They got NFL players all across the board. And Florida State, when you are the only team in the history of college football to win your conference title and finish last place in your conference the year after, you shouldn't be worried about talking smack about the other team. You should be worried about making sure that your game is going to be up to snuff so you can actually compete with Alabama. Because this game, yeah, it's a P4 versus P4, but let's just be honest about it. Alabama versus Florida State is like Alabama going up against Alabama A&M. It's not going to be close. There's just such a big talent discrepancy, and I get it. The game's got to get played, and it is difficult to win on the road, especially in a tough environment that is Doak Campbell, but everybody was winning that Doak Campbell last season. Florida State, for a team that is just coming off such a disastrous season, for any player to come out and make any comments like this, it's just insanity to me. Congratulations, Tommy Castellanos. Your confidence just got FSU a death sentence in week 1 against the Tide, because the Crimson Tide are about to come into Doak Campbell and roll. Don't make promises that you can't keep. That's how the old saying goes, and Jeremiah Smith might have just did that. He just promised for the next 2 years that Ohio State is going to beat Michigan, and he's going to do everything in his ability to ensure that that happens. And we've heard this before from Jack Sawyer, CJ Stroud, and you know what they were unable to do? Beat Michigan. And for the past 4 years, I've been picking Ohio State to beat Michigan, and I've been wrong every single year. And last season, I thought there was no chance in hell. I thought it was impossible for Ohio State to lose to Michigan with them putting $20 million into last year's team. And yet, despite being a 3-touchdown favorite going into that game, they still lost to Michigan, who basically played all of last season with both their hands wrapped around their back because they had no quarterback play. I thought that Ohio State not only was going to beat Michigan, but they were going to pound them into oblivion. I thought it was going to be 42-7. I thought it was going to be the most uncompetitive game between these two schools in the history that has been played. But instead, it was one of the biggest upsets of all time. Because Ohio State, after that game, not only did they go on to win a national championship, but they had one of the most dominant championship runs ever. They squashed teams that would have blitzed Michigan, cream pie Tennessee, cream pie Oregon, cream pie Notre Dame. Yet they lost to a team that they were favored to beat by over 3 touchdowns. I can't get it. I don't know what it's going to take for Ohio State to beat Michigan. Even if Ohio State had a full team of Jeremiah Smiths, I still don't believe they would be able to beat Michigan. And that's not because I'm a Ohio State hater, but I've just betted against Michigan for so many years in a row to lose this game, and they've proved me wrong every single year. And what's even more terrifying is that Ohio State lost to Michigan with a team that they spent $20 million on. Now you got Michigan, who's doing the same thing they're doing. They're spending money now. They paid $13.5 million for Bryce Underwood. They're investing a lot of money into recruiting now. So they're going to be on the same level as you in the next 2 to 3 years. And if you can't beat Michigan before they were spending money, it's hard to see you being able to beat Michigan now that they are spending money. Jeremiah Smith is an absolute dog, but they're going to need more than just him to beat Michigan. They have had the talent advantage over Michigan for the last 4 years, although some may counter that point and say that Michigan didn't start winning this game until they started cheating, which, okay, you got a good point with that. Ever since they started stealing signs, they've been unbeatable, but when they got caught, You seen what happened last year. They came right back down to earth. But listen, I'm going to give credit when credit is due. Michigan last season came out and they gave it to Ohio State physically. They pushed Ohio State around in a way that they weren't pushed around all throughout 2024. It may be a mentality thing. Maybe they're not amped up enough. You know what Ryan Day needs to do before Ohio State plays Michigan this year? He needs to invite Ray Lewis to give the pregame speech before this game. I bet that'll have everybody ramped up, or even do something better. Have Kirby Smart give the pregame speech. We want to come out here and fuck some shit up. That's how Ohio State has to come out when they play Michigan. They got to come out with a high level of intensity. All the Ohio State players talk about how much they hate Michigan, how much they despise this team, and yet they don't play like it. I don't see the hate. I see the hate after the game, but it's like, okay, you already lost off the field, or you already lost on the field. Now you want to get another butt whooping off it, trying to fight them post-game? No. Ohio State has to have that same level of fight during this game as what they did last year when Michigan tried to plant their flag. That's how Ohio State has to play Michigan, man. They got to come out here with a high level of intensity, and they got to come out here like they're trying to knock everybody's helmet off. Just simple as that. It's just a mentality thing, and I don't understand it, because Ohio State is just far superior from a talent standpoint than what Michigan is. But last year's Michigan win over Ohio State taught me a valuable lesson about rivalry games in college football. You can never expect a team to win a rivalry game simply because they have the better team on paper. Rivalry games are played a lot differently than your regular game. There's just a different level of intensity, and just with the style that the game is played, you don't really know who can win. There's just so many different variables that goes into winning rivalry games. You simply can't say, oh, they're going to win this game because they out-recruit them, they outspend them. No, it's just something different about these rivalry games. So Jeremiah Smith, you're an animal. But Ohio State needs about 11 of you to beat Michigan. At least that's what it looks like it's going to take. I don't know why Ohio State just continues to lose to Michigan, but until I actually see Ohio State beat this team, I can't agree with Jeremiah Smith on his promise, because we've seen a bunch of other great Ohio State players lose to Michigan. C.J. Stroud is the most prolific quarterback that Ohio State has ever had, and he played some of his worst games ever against Michigan. Jeremiah Smith, we didn't really hear his name that much when they went up against Michigan last year, even though he did score, but he wasn't as dominant as what he was for all throughout the season. It's just something different when Ohio State plays Michigan, and until I see this team actually beat them, I'm not going to make any guarantees. I'm not going to make any promises. When I give my prediction for this game, I'm not going to have one. I'm going to say, I think Ohio State can win, but I'm not going to guarantee it. I would not be surprised if Michigan continued to win this game for the next decade. I mean, eventually Ohio State has to win. You would think so, but with the way this game has gone, you never know when that's going to happen. You just got to see it to believe it. For some reason, people never learned their lesson about sleeping on South Carolina. They do it every season. Last year, they were projected to finish in the bottom half of the SEC, and they won 9 games. And 2022, they had a projected win total of 6.5, and they finished with 8 wins. And 2024, they were supposed to finish with no more than 6 wins according to Vegas, and they went 9-4. And yet, entering this season, South Carolina is still being slept on, is still being disrespected. The ESPN FPI Football Power Index projects them to finish 9th place in this conference. Look, eventually, college football is going to learn their lesson about continuing to sleep on the Beamer boys. No head coach gets you better prepared to win a big game as an underdog than what Shane Beamer does. This guy is an incredible head coach, and he's incredibly underrated. Not only is Shane Beamer an elite big game coach, but South Carolina is going into this season with two of the best players in the SEC who respectively rank within the 5 best players in the sport for 2025. That being Lenore Sellers and Dylan Stewart. When you have arguably two of the best players at their position at the most impactful spots that contribute to winning and losing, it's hard to see South Carolina finishing in the bottom half of the SEC this year. With the way Lenore Sellers played at the second half of last season, when he had over 18 touchdowns, he limited his turnovers, he had 18 broken tackles against Clemson, he single-handedly won South Carolina that game. We saw Dylan Stewart take over games and just completely obliterate offensive lines despite being double team, triple team, quadruple team. You can't stop Lenore Sellers and Dylan Stewart. And that's what makes South Carolina a great team entering the upcoming 2025 college football season. Even if the rest of their team isn't that good, the fact that you have two of the best players at two of the most impactful positions that affect the outcome of games is what makes South Carolina a sneaky team to win the SEC this year. Imagine if they can finally get some solid offensive line play. Imagine if Nick Harbor takes a massive leap and improvement this year. You already have an experienced secondary, and they do a really good job of developing on the defensive line. They have one of the best strength and conditioning programs in the nation. If you saw South Carolina's players at the combine this past year, everybody had freakish results. You got guys running all kinds of crazy 40 times, destroying the bench press. South Carolina is breeding metahumans down there. This is just not your average run-of-the-mill team that has two great players and they're mid elsewhere. No, this is a team that has two great players with a head coach that always has his squad ready to play in big games against some of the best. If there's any team that you should not sleep on, it is the Beamer Boys. It is the South Carolina Gamecocks. But for some reason, nobody learns their lesson about sleeping on this team. Do you remember what they did at the end of 2022? They destroyed Tennessee. They ended Hendon Hooker's season and Tennessee's college football playoff hopes. Then they go on to destroy Clemson. I mean, South Carolina at the end of 2022 was on an absolute warpath. They have a win total of 7.5 this year. Easy money. Take the over. This is going to be a 9-win team at the bare minimum. The ceiling for South Carolina is incredibly high, and the floor is just as high. This team, at least on paper, should be able to be a contender for the college football playoffs. Hell, you could have made the argument that they deserved to get in last year. They beat Missouri. They should have beaten LSU, but they got effed over by the refs. They were only a few possessions away from really being a 1-loss, 2-loss team. They could have beaten Alabama. There were a bunch of games that South Carolina lost last year that came down to the flip of a coin toss, really. It's just ridiculous that nobody learns their lesson about what happens when you sleep on the Beamer Boys. Eventually, you're going to learn, because when they prove you wrong once again, then you're going to go in the next season to hype them up to not just make it to the playoffs, but really be a contender in the SEC. No, South Carolina is a contender in the SEC right now entering this season. Lenore Sellers is the best quarterback in college football. He's the closest thing that we've had to Cam Newton. You got Dylan Stewart, who's like Jadeveon Clowney, reincarnated. Stop sleeping on South Carolina. You didn't learn the last couple of years when you slept on this team, and you still are going to keep sleeping on them? Come on now. You got to wake up eventually on the Beamer boys. There's not a more disrespected program in college football right now than Oklahoma. Last year was the worst season that they've had in over 26 years. They had injuries coming out of fall camp, which essentially ended their season before it even started. You were depleted on the offensive line. You were ravished at wide receiver to the point where you had to start a bunch of young guys who had no experience. And then you had no quarterback play. Oklahoma was trying to win games their first season in the SEC like they were Iowa. And you can't win that way. You can't win in college football's toughest conference being all defense and have no offense at all. Oklahoma is going to bounce back this season in a major way. Everything that hindered this squad last year has been addressed. You fixed the quarterback issue, bringing in John Mateer. You also have a new offensive coordinator in Ben Arbuckle, who follows John Mateer down to Norman. You have one of the best running backs that was available in the spring portal cycle in Jaden Ott from Cal. You are loaded at receiver. Deion Brooks is primed for a breakout season. We seem to forget how much of a stud he was at Purdue a few years ago. And we know with Brent Venables taking over the defense that this is going to continue to be an elite unit. You can't define what Oklahoma is going to be this season based off an all-time outlier with how bad last year was. And even if Brent Venables does flame out this year and the Sooners don't win too many games, that doesn't mean that Oklahoma is all of a sudden going to become irrelevant in the SEC. They're going to be the equivalent to what Nebraska has been in the Big Ten since they joined that conference, because Oklahoma has too much money and too many resources to be irrelevant in this new age of college football. If Brent Venables doesn't work out and they have to fire him, they got more than enough money. They'll go out and get a guy like a Fran Brown from Syracuse who just won 10 games in his first season. Or they could go down the street and get Rhett Lashley from SMU. Oklahoma has all of the resources to be an elite program in the SEC. This was already an elite SEC program before they even got to this conference. They were beating up on the Big 12. They won 10 games not too long ago, and they beat Texas as well. It's not as if Oklahoma is just incapable of being able to compete in the SEC. When you have no quarterback and you got a guy in Jackson Arnold who essentially was so bad at taking care of the football, you would have thought that he was colluding with Vegas to fix some of Oklahoma's games. You're not going to survive in this conference when you have to overcome that along with a bunch of injuries. There already are too many teams in the SEC that have quality rosters as it is. So when you go into the year down the majority of your top players due to injuries, it's a recipe for disaster in the SEC. Even Georgia had a down year last season. Now, although they were able to overcome that and still win this conference, that was because they have Kirby Smart. Brent Venables isn't Kirby Smart, but nobody is. That's why he's the undisputed #1 coach in college football right now. Unless you have an all-time great head coach, anybody would have suffered the same fate that Brent Venables did with how bad of a team Oklahoma was offensively. Having a great defense only gets you so far. Iowa wins in the Big Ten because you're not going up against a bunch of quality rosters week after week like what Oklahoma had to last season. You have to play Tennessee, Texas, Georgia, Alabama. It just was a season that Oklahoma just had to take on the chin, learn from, and be able to regroup. And that's exactly what they've done. This season, Brent Venables has assembled a borderline playoff team entering a crucial year of his Oklahoma tenure. With how good John Mateer is going to be, he should be Oklahoma's equivalent to what Cam Ward was for Miami last season. And I expect for the Sooners to at least win 9 games and be a possible 3-loss team that gets into the CFP this year. This team has recruited incredibly well. Brent Venables has brought in 2 top 10 recruiting classes over his time here, and he also has done a really good job at developing talent and getting it to the next level. Oklahoma can't be defined by 2024 when there were so many other reasons for why that team was bad other than them being Oklahoma. Oklahoma's talked about like they're Northwestern or Vanderbilt or somebody like that, when they're not. This is a program that's been to the college football multiple times over the past decade. They've been in several New Year's Six bowl games. So I'm not about to call a team irrelevant because they make a move to a tougher conference solely based off the worst season that they've had in 26 years. Oklahoma is so hated right now because of how dominant they've been in the last decade that college football so badly wants them to all of a sudden be made irrelevant by the SEC when that's not going to happen. They just have way too much available at their disposal for them to become irrelevant in this conference. They are nothing like Nebraska. They are far more superior than what Nebraska is in terms of money to use and recruiting and the transfer portal, along with other resources. If a head coach right now, like Fran Brown, had to choose between coaching at Nebraska and coaching at Oklahoma, he's picking Oklahoma, which is why the comparison to Nebraska, I think, is just a little bit of exaggeration to me. Because even when Nebraska was in the Big 12, they still really weren't that good. So it's not really a surprise they've been as down and out as what they have over the last couple of years in the Big 10. They've also made a bunch of bad hires. Oklahoma hasn't made a bunch of bad hires. So unless Oklahoma continues to get it wrong at head coach, if Brent Venables does get the boot, that's the only way Oklahoma is truly going to fall off. Oklahoma is one of the best jobs in college football. You just have to be Gene Chizik level bad to fail as the head coach for this program with how good of a situation that Mark Stoops put this team in before he ended up giving it over to Lincoln Riley. Or Bob Stoops. I don't know if I got it wrong. Bob Stoops, Mark Stoops. I get them mixed up commonly, but you guys get my point. Oklahoma is built to survive in the SEC. They're not about to become Nebraska of this conference. They just have way too much for that to happen, and they're going to be really good this season. DJ Lagway has been hyped up to be the Messiah of Florida this year. And as good as what he was last season and as good as what he will be this year coming up, Florida has more than just DJ Lagway that makes them a team that nobody in the SEC should want to play this year. They're going to have a really good rushing attack with Jaden Ball, who was a SEC all-freshman selection last year. He led this team in rushing with 673 yards. He also was averaging over 5 yards per carry. And Florida was 3-0 when him and DJ Lagway were in the backfield as starters. They also have a loaded room of wide receivers. They have one of the deepest wide receiver rooms in the SEC entering this season. You got Eugene Wilson, who was a freshman All-American a few years ago. He missed majority of 2024 due to injuries. He's going to shape back in a major way, and he's easily going to become one of the better receivers in this conference. And then Aiden Mizell, former 5-star coming out of high school. He's a huge breakout candidate for the Gators this year. He had 2 touchdowns that went for over 40 yards last season. He was one of 7 receivers in the SEC to do so. You got Michael Sturdivant, a transfer from UCLA, who was incredibly utilized during his time with the Bruins. He had 2 100-yard receiving games last year. He was averaging 14 yards per reception, and that's with the quarterback play being all over the place last season. But what makes Florida so formidable on offense outside of DJ Lagway, how good their ground game is going to be, and how deep the receiving core is that they have one of the 5 best offensive lines in college football coming into this season. They returned 4 starters on the O-line for this year. They gave up the 3rd least amount of sacks in the SEC last year. And you have Jake Slaughter, who's going to be commanding that offensive line at center. He was a first-team All-American last year. And they got a bunch of guys on this offensive line that should be high draft picks in the first couple of rounds of the 2026 draft. And if you thought that Florida's offense wasn't scary enough, the Gators' defensive line this year could be the best in the SEC this season. You return 3 of your leading sack producers from 2024. You got defensive tackle Caleb Banks, who reminds me a lot of Chris Jones, Jalen Carter. He's a really disruptive pass rusher. And if he improves his run-stopping ability, he's going to be the best defensive tackle in the nation this year. Then you got defensive end Tyreek Sapp. That last name sound familiar to you? It should, because he is the nephew of Hall of Fame defensive lineman Warren Sapp, and he led the Gators in sacks last year with 7. He's coming back. Then you got George Gums, who had 5 sacks last year, second on the team. Florida's going to have a really scary defensive line this year. Their defensive line could be much better than what Georgia's will be this year, just because they return more proven production at this position than what the Dogs do. And Cormani McClain is due for a breakout season this year with Florida. He's been the talk of Florida's offseason. All they were talking about in spring was how he put on a bunch of muscle. He was clocking in at 23 miles per hour. The guy was the former #1 overall corner in his recruiting class. The potential is there. The athleticism, the traits is all there for him to become one of the best cornerbacks, not just in the SEC, but in all of college football this year. And not just does Florida have Cormani McClain, who could break out, but this entire secondary could break out. They returned all their starters from last year, and their secondary improved tremendously throughout the beginning of last season to the end of last season. So Florida is more than just DJ Lagway. DJ Lagway is going to be part of the engine that makes Florida a great team this year, but they have other parts around them that should be just as good as what DJ Lagway is going to be. This is one of the better teams that Florida has put on the field in a few years now. And it's taken Billy Napier a while to get the ball rolling down there in Gainesville, but a huge reason why they gave him a 4th season to prove himself is because 70% of Florida's NIL money is tied into a lot of these young guys who are going to step up and break out for Florida this year. So DJ Lagway isn't the only thing that makes Florida horrifying going into this season. Dominant rushing attack. You got a loaded receiver room. You're going to have one of the best offensive lines in college football, along with a defensive line that will be just as good, with 3 potential first 3-round draft picks, and you're going to have an experienced secondary. Look out for Florida. This team isn't getting hyped up just because they have DJ Lagway, the new messiah. This is a really good team. We're entering the month of July, and USC recruiting is still on fire. They still have the #1 class in America at the moment, and despite all of the haters saying, oh, USC recruiting always starts out hot, eventually they're going to get a wave of decommits. Well, it seems like the commits are rolling in by the day for USC, and eventually I'm going to end up committing to USC. At this point, they're getting everybody. It seems like everybody they go after commits to this program. And with how dominant USC's recruiting has been this year, it's a sign that the Trojans are about to experience a renaissance. Do you remember the golden age of USC football that everybody always talks about under Pete Carroll? Well, we could see that era return under Lincoln Riley, and it freaks out college football because can you imagine how elite USC can be with recruiting, NIL now being weaponized? not just can USC lock down the state of California, but they can get anybody from any state, rather it be Texas, Florida, and with the level of talent that USC is going to be bringing in, they're going to have a roster that's good enough to compete with the Ohio States, the Bamas, the Georgias of the world, and that's what makes the future of USC football so scary under Lincoln Riley. Yes, the Trojans have regressed the last couple of years since his first season when he won 11 games, and they went 7-6 last year. But you're not always what your record says you are. And a bunch of those 6 losses, USC lost them because they imploded in the final minutes of those games, like when they lost to Maryland and Mike Locksley, when they got ground and pounded to oblivion by Michigan. I've never seen a team engineer a 2-minute game-winning drive solely running the football. USC got a tough awakening their first season in the Big Ten, but now that's about to change because they have improved the level of talent that they're bringing in. They're recruiting on par with the Oregons and Ohio States of this conference, and plus with how improved their defensive line and offensive line is going to be, they're going to be better suited to sustain a high level of play and the rough style that the Big Ten likes to play football with. Now you're not going to be able to just gash USC on the ground. Now you're not going to be able to just push them around on the offensive line. They're not going to be the finesse team this season that you saw last year. They're going to be more committed to the run. They're going to be more balanced. And you already have one of the best receivers in the nation, and Malachi Lemon, who doesn't get talked about enough. You got Jaden Mayava, who could end up being the best quarterback in the Big Ten this year. Lincoln Riley is the quarterback guru of college football. There is no QBU in college football because Lincoln Riley is QBU. Nearly every quarterback that he touches turns to gold. And even Miller Moss last season, despite him getting benched, he wasn't really all that bad, at least compared to the quarterback play that you were seeing in the other Big Ten, and at least compared to the other quarterback play that you were seeing being played in the Big Ten by Iowa and Minnesota. Miller Moss was relatively decent. So if Jaden Mayava was good enough to start over him, I can only imagine how good he's going to be his second year in this Lincoln Riley system. And Deanne Landis in year 2 calling plays for USC's defense. I think the floor for USC is 8 wins, but the ceiling is 11 wins. And I wouldn't be shocked if we see the Trojans competing for the Big Ten championship this year. That's how good this team has the potential to be if everything goes right. So USC, with the level of dominance that they've had on the recruiting trail right now, college football should be really freaked out, because the last thing you want to see is USC finally getting the ball rolling and actually being able to weaponize the local recruiting talent that they have in California. If USC can lock down at least the majority of the blue chip guys in that state, they're going to be good enough to win a national championship, and they don't even have to leave their backyard to do so. That's what made those Pete Carroll teams so great. They were able to keep that great in-state talent at home, and they also were able to branch out to a few other of the talent-rich states to get some of those best recruits, and that's why they were so dominant during that golden age of USC football. And we're starting to see this program experience a renaissance. It starts by winning the offseason with recruiting. Then you start to see that momentum trickle down to the play that you see on the field. I see why college football hates USC so much. It's not that you hate USC for what they have been, but you hate what USC has the ability to become when they actually have everything going right for them on the field and in recruiting. And that's why USC's recruiting dominance right now is freaking everybody out, because they know what this team is about to be with what they have coming in recruiting. Paul Finebaum must be stopped. He said one of the most outrageous things that I've ever heard a college football analyst say. He called Arch Manning the best quarterback that college football has seen since Tim Tebow came into play in 2006 That is just downright blasphemy on so many different levels. First of all, Paul Finebaum is disrespecting the greatness of Cam Newton. Cam Newton is the second best quarterback in the history of this sport behind Tim Tebow. When he walked into Auburn, he immediately not just made them the best team in the SEC, but he won them the national championship solely by himself, damn near. The other NFL player that he played with on that squad was Nick Fairley. That was it. His receivers weren't good. His offensive line wasn't that good. Hell, his coach wasn't that good. Right after he left, Gene Chizik, 2 years removed from that national championship that Cam Newton won him, got fired and he was replaced by Gus Malzahn. What about Lamar Jackson? Lamar had one of the most video game-like seasons that we've ever seen a quarterback put up when he won the Heisman at Louisville. What about Baker Mayfield? He had a storied career at Oklahoma. He was a multiple-time Heisman finalist playing for the Sooners. There are just so many great quarterbacks that have come after Tim Tebow that it makes it outrageous for Paul Finebaum to say that Arch Manning is already better than all of those guys when we've only seen him start in 2 games. And the Arch Manning hype is the sole reason why guys like him oftentimes disappoint. Because it's not that they end up being bad. Arch Manning definitely should become a really good quarterback. But if he doesn't live up to the high level of expectations that the media has set for him, if he doesn't win the Heisman, if he doesn't have Joe Burrow 2019-like numbers, people are going to view him as a disappointment when he could still be a good enough quarterback to win a national championship for Texas. He could still be the number 1 overall pick in the NFL draft whenever he chooses to come out. But with all of this hype that guys like Paul Finebaum are giving him, saying that he's the best quarterback since Tim Tebow, it's how guys like Arch Manning end up disappointing, not because they don't play well on the field, but because they don't justify the amount of hype that they receive in the offseason. We've seen it so many times with guys like DJ Uiagalelei, who was supposed to be the next great Clemson quarterback when Trevor Lawrence left. And we saw how that worked out. Expectations can be a killer. That's one of the oldest sayings that still holds true to this day in life. You are defined by your expectations. They can make or break you. And the expectations that Paul Finebaum is putting on Arch Manning, it's just too high to live up to. Tim Tebow not only is the best quarterback that college football has ever had, but he's the most accomplished. He was a Heisman finalist for 3 straight years. He won a national championship. He's kind of like a folklore of college football in a sense. You know, he's like a mystical figure in this sport. When you think about college football, if college football had a face as a player, it would be Tim Tebow. So to say that Arch Manning is the best quarterback since Tim Tebow entered the scene in 2006, it's just outrageous. They just let anybody talk on ESPN nowadays, huh? That's what ESPN has become. It's just trying to say the most outlandish things possible. What happened to giving good analysis that was rooted in facts and substance? We don't have any facts that Arch Manning is going to be as good as what Tim Tebow was. I get everybody can make predictions and projections, but this one is kind of out there.